June 16, 1955. Portland Harbour. The water is calm. The submarine HMS Sidon lies moored alongside her depot ship, the HMS Maidstone. It is a quiet morning in the early Cold War. Inside the forward torpedo room, the crew is preparing to go to sea for firing practice. 2 experimental Mark 12 torpedoes have been embarked for trial firings. This weapon is codenamed Fancy. It is fast lethal and fueled by a chemical that barely tolerates existence. At 0825, the silence breaks. There is no warning siren. There is no enemy contact. There is only a sudden, violent roar inside the number 3 torpedo tube. The submarine has not been hit by a depth charge. She has been murdered from the inside by her own experimental ordnance. This is the nightmare scenario later described as a torpedo hot run inside the tube. The weapon begins to run up while it is still locked inside the submarine. The Mark 12 is powered by high-test peroxide. In contact with incompatible materials and catalysts, it can decompose violently into superheated steam and oxygen. In a confined torpedo body, that expansion is not a burn. It is a pressure event. The physics of the failure are absolute. The trigger was a chain of small mechanical actions inside the weapon. A starting lever was accidentally moved as a stop valve was opened. A delay device failed. The motor stalled and pressure rose until a line burst inside the torpedo. High-test peroxide sprayed into the casing and onto incompatible fittings. The decomposition accelerated into thermal runaway. The bow cap of number 3 tube and the rear door failed. The violence did not vent cleanly out to sea. It drove backward into the torpedo room. The immediate consequence is not just flooding, it is a chemical assault. The compartment is instantly filled with scalding steam, toxic smoke, and unburned propellant. The explosion buckles the watertight bulkheads and shatters the hull integrity. The bow of the submarine loses buoyancy immediately. The laws of naval architecture take over. The weight of the flooding water drags the forward section down. The submarine begins to pivot on her mooring lines. She is tethered to the depot ship Maidstone, which creates a secondary crisis. As the Sidon sinks, she threatens to pull the larger vessel over or tear the steel bollards from the deck. The crew on the bridge of the Maidstone watches in horror as the submarine settles low in the water. Smoke pours from the conning tower. The sinking is not instantaneous, but it is relentless. It takes 20 minutes. In that short window, the surviving crew must escape a hull that is rapidly becoming a tomb. But the men in the forward torpedo room are trapped behind a wall of fire and toxic gas. The submarine dips her bow and slides beneath the surface. She comes to rest on the harbor floor. The depth is about 36 feet. The hull is fully submerged. The immediate violence has ended. The silence returns, the number sounds small, and that false comfort is one of the oldest traps in salvage. But inside the steel casing, 13 men are missing and the chemical fire is still burning oxygen. The question is no longer about testing a weapon. It is about how to claw a submarine back from the dead before the physics of the harbor floor claims the survivors. The violence has ended, but the interior has not cooled into safety. Men near the conning tower hatch claw their way into daylight. Forward, others are still inside, cut off by wreckage, rising water, and a compartment poisoned by steam and oxidizer. The disaster has already shifted from an accident to an arithmetic problem. How many can be pulled out before the hull becomes a sealed furnace? One man sees that arithmetic and refuses to accept it. On the deck of the depot ship, Maidstone stands Surgeon Lieutenant Charles Rhodes. He is a doctor, not a salvage engineer. He is not a qualified submariner. He watches the smoke billowing from the open hatch of the Sidon. Most men are running away from the epicenter of the explosion. Rhodes runs toward it. He boards the sinking hull before it fully settles and assists the first wave of stunned survivors. But the count is wrong. There are still men inside. Rhodes makes a choice that changes the classification of the event from an accident to a battlefield action. He prepares to enter the gas-filled interior. To survive in the toxic atmosphere, Rhodes puts on a piece of equipment known as the DSEA, or Davis Submerged Escape Apparatus. This device is the standard Royal Navy escape gear of the 1950s. It is a closed-circuit rebreather designed to allow a submariner to float to the surface from deep water. It consists of a breathing bag, a mouthpiece, and a canister of chemical absorbent to scrub carbon dioxide from the exhaled breath. It is a life-saving tool, but it has a ruthless physiological cost for the untrained user. The DSEA supplies oxygen in a closed circuit. It can keep a man alive, but it also removes the normal sensory margin that tells the body it is in trouble. Under exertion, a user can accumulate carbon dioxide, and with oxygen at elevated partial pressure, there is also the risk of rapid incapacitation. Rhodes puts on this set without the years of drilling that submariners receive. He grabs a syringe of morphine and climbs down the ladder into the darkness. The conditions inside the Sidon are hostile to human biology. The air is thick with the chemical steam from the torpedo reaction and the black smoke of burning electrical insulation. Visibility is zero. Rhodes manages to locate a survivor and guide him to the ladder. He goes back below again into the smoke and chemical steam. He succeeds in helping men reach the hatch. Then the fumes and the hostile atmosphere finally claim him. He does not return. The rescue phase ends in silence. The final toll is 13 men dead, including the surgeon. The submarine is now a war grave sitting in the mud of a friendly harbor. The hatch is secured. The immediate rush of adrenaline fades, leaving a cold engineering reality. The Royal Navy cannot leave the Sidon on the bottom. They need the bodies, they need the evidence, and they need to secure the unexploded ordnance that might still be unstable inside the flooded tube. The operation shifts from rescue to recovery. The clock is no longer measured in minutes of air, but in days of endurance. The wreck of the Sidon sits at an awkward angle on the harbor floor in a crowded mooring area. Any lift has to be controlled to prevent the submarine shifting into nearby hulls or tearing out harbor fittings. The Royal Navy salvage team faces a physics problem. The S-class boat's submerged displacement is approximately 990 tons. With compartments flooded and watertight integrity compromised, she has lost her reserve buoyancy and behaves like dead weight on the seabed. To break the suction of the harbor mud and lift the vessel, the engineers need a force greater than gravity. Standard dockyard cranes are insufficient. They cannot reach the necessary angle without risking stability. The solution requires an external buoyancy system that can be bolted directly to the corpse of the submarine. In the first hours after the sinking, divers were flown in and worked through the night to rig the hull and attach high-pressure air hoses. An early attempt to salvage her by blowing air into the boat failed because the damage could not be sealed, and the air escaped as fast as it was pumped in. The Admiralty then committed specialist salvage vessels, including Keenbrace and Swin, with Barfoss also in attendance. They bring external buoyancy, they bring the camels. A lifting camel is a masterclass in mechanical simplicity. It is a massive cylindrical pontoon constructed of heavy gauge steel. It functions like an artificial lung. The concept relies on the manipulation of density. On the surface, the camel is filled with water until it loses its positive buoyancy. It sinks under control, guided by cables down to the wreck site. Once positioned alongside the submarine, it is secured to the hull using thick wire hawsers passed under the keel or attached to strengthening points. The lifting phase reverses the process. Compressed air is pumped down from the surface vessels into the camel. The air forces the water out through open valves at the bottom of the cylinder. As the water exits, the camel becomes lighter than the surrounding sea. It fights to return to the surface, pulling the attached submarine with it. The salvage plan for the Sidon calls for a cradle lift. 4 camels will be used, 2 on the port side and 2 on the starboard side. They will act as a giant pneumatic harness, cradling the broken submarine and carrying it up. The operation is driven by a ruthless timeline. It has been less than a day since the sinking. The goal is to raise the boat within a week of the accident. This speed is not just for public relations, it is an operational necessity. The longer the submarine sits in the mud, the more the sediment will grip the keel, increasing the force required to break it free. The engineers calculate the load paths and the tension limits of the wire ropes. The plan is theoretically sound. The camels provide the muscle, the pumps provide the energy. But the connection point is the weak link. To attach these steel giants to the submarine, divers must descend into the kill zone and thread the heavy cables by hand. The engineering logic is perfect, but the environment where the work must be done is about to become the antagonist. The action descends from the heavy industrial logic of the surface vessels into the intimate and claustrophobic world of the diver. At that depth, a diver would normally expect routine conditions. In a salvage context involving chemical ordnance, it becomes an environment that neutralizes human senses. The water in Portland Harbour is naturally turbid, but around the hull of the Sidon, the visibility has been reduced to zero. The explosion has churned up the harbor floor, mixing centuries of silt with diesel fuel and the chemical residue of the high-test peroxide. The divers must descend into this blind zone to execute the most delicate phase of the plan. They must physically connect the lifting camels to the broken submarine. This is not a matter of simply hooking a line. They must pass heavy wire hawsers underneath the keel or secure them to structural hardpoints. They are working by touch alone in water that feels greasy with contaminants. They are crawling over a steel carcass that has been ripped open by an internal blast. Jagged plates of steel and torn electrical cables create a tangle of snag hazards. If a diver gets caught, the murky water makes visual rescue impossible. There is a chemical shadow hanging over every movement. The divers are swimming in the wake of a reaction triggered by the copper catalyst. This obscure interaction between the copper fittings and the peroxide fuel was the spark that sank the ship. Now the salvage team faces a lingering threat. The torpedo that exploded has vented its energy, but the second torpedo in the tube next to it might still be intact. Or worse, it might be damaged and leaking. High-test peroxide is an unstable oxidizer. If pockets of the fluid remain trapped in the torpedo room, they pose a severe chemical burn risk to the divers. This creates a paradox of toxicity versus oxygen. The initial explosion generated a massive volume of pure oxygen as the peroxide decomposed. In a normal fire, oxygen is consumed. In an HTP event, oxygen is created, fueling the combustion of everything around it. The result is a bizarre atmospheric profile inside the hull. The fire burned with terrifying intensity, consuming the paint, the insulation, and the air itself, while simultaneously feeding the flames with fresh oxygen. The smoke that poured out was a toxic cocktail of burning rubber and unspent propellant. The divers sealing the hull are locking this poisonous atmosphere inside. They are not just rigging a lift, they are sealing a hazardous waste container. The work is slow and punishing. The divers must drag the heavy steel cables through the mud, fighting the suction of the harbor floor. They thread the wires through the lifting eyes of the camels. Every connection must be checked by hand. A loose shackle or a frayed wire could cause the load to shift during the lift. If the submarine slips from the cradle, it could roll and crush the divers working below. The margin for error is non-existent. The team works in shifts, ignoring the chemical sting in the water and the psychological weight of the bodies entombed inches away behind the steel plating. Finally, the last shackle is hammered home. The rigging is complete. The physics of the lift are now locked in place. The only thing left to do is to apply the power. June 23, 1955. Exactly 7 days have passed since the explosion. The salvage fleet is positioned directly over the grave of the submarine. The preparation phase is over. The divers have retreated from the hazardous water. The operation now enters the kinetic phase. The goal is to break the HMS Sidon free from the harbor floor and bring her back to the surface. But the physics of the lift are complicated by a phenomenon that often wrecks salvage attempts in shallow water. The enemy is no longer just gravity, it is the seabed itself. The submarine is resting in the soft clay and silt of Portland Harbour. Over the last week, the hull has settled deeper into the sediment. This creates a powerful seal along the length of the keel. When a vessel sinks into mud, the water underneath is displaced. This eliminates the buoyant force acting on the bottom of the hull and replaces it with a vacuum effect. This is known as ground reaction or mud suction. To lift the submarine, the salvage engineers must overcome not only the 990 tons of submerged displacement, but also the phantom weight of this suction. It acts like a glue holding the steel plating down. If the lifting force is applied too aggressively, the cables might snap under the sudden tension. If it is applied too unevenly, the hull might break free at one end while the other remains stuck, causing the submarine to snap its back. The application of force must be gradual and overwhelming. The order is given to activate the compressors. On the decks of the salvage vessels, the machinery roars to life. High-pressure air is pumped down the hoses into the 4 lifting camels secured to the sides of the submarine. These steel lungs begin to purge their ballast water. The surface of the harbor begins to boil as the displaced water and venting air rush to the top. Down below, the physics of buoyancy are shifting. The camels are becoming positively buoyant. They are fighting to rise. The wire ropes connecting them to the submarine go taut. The tension builds. The metal groans under the strain. For a few critical moments, nothing happens. The lift force is fighting the adhesion of the mud. Then with a sudden shudder, the vacuum breaks. The suction releases its grip. The submarine lurches upward. The camels accelerate toward the surface, cradling the hull in their steel embrace. The lift is controlled but violent. The water churns as the massive pontoons break the surface, followed by the black shape of the conning tower. The Sidon does not look like a ship returning home. She looks like a casualty held in a cradle lift between four camels. She was raised on the morning of June 23, 1955. The salvage vessels take the assembly in tow and move it toward a causeway off Chesil Beach. The next day, the submarine is beached on hard shingle, where she can be stabilized and made safe. She is secure. The tide recedes, revealing the full extent of the tragedy. The pressure hull is intact, but the forward casing is mangled. The bow cap of number 3 tube is shattered. The submarine has been retrieved from the bottom. Over the following days, the dead can be recovered and the evidence can be secured for the investigators. The physical battle is won. The engineering challenge is complete. Now the forensic story begins. The year is 1957. 2 years have passed since the disaster in Portland Harbour. The hull of the submarine HMS Sidon is floating once again, but she is not returning to active service. She is being towed out to sea for the final time. She is no longer a commissioned warship. She is a test subject. The salvage operation in 1955 had succeeded in raising the boat, but it could not save her career or the 13 men who died inside. The true value of the recovery was not the steel of the hull, but the knowledge locked inside the torpedo tubes. When the Sidon was beached on the Chesil Beach Causeway in June 1955, the Royal Navy launched a forensic investigation. This defines the discipline of forensic salvage. Unlike commercial salvage, which seeks profit or asset recovery, forensic salvage seeks the truth of a technical failure. The submarine was treated as a crime scene. The investigators carefully dismantled the forward section. They removed the debris of the number 3 torpedo tube. They extracted the shattered remains of the Mark 12 torpedo. The evidence confirmed the engineers' worst fears. The investigation pinpointed the interaction between the high-test peroxide fuel and the copper fittings inside the weapon. The copper acted as a catalyst, triggering the violent decomposition of the oxidizer. The weapon known as Fancy was indeed fast. It could propel a torpedo at speeds over 28 knots without leaving a visible wake. But the chemistry was too volatile for the confined environment of a submarine. The salvage of the Sidon provided the physical proof that the design was fundamentally flawed. The consequence of this finding was a strategic pivot. The Sidon inquiry helped drive the Royal Navy away from peroxide propulsion in submarine torpedoes. By 1959, the Mark 12 was withdrawn. The promise of speed and range was no longer worth the price of an oxidizer that could turn a torpedo room into a pressure vessel. Sidon became the warning the service could not reinterpret. The human cost of the lesson was formalized in the honors list. Surgeon Lieutenant Charles Rhodes was posthumously awarded the Albert Medal for his rescue attempt. In later reforms, the Albert Medal itself was terminated, and surviving holders were offered the option to exchange it for the George Cross. But in 1955, the award stood as a blunt measure of what it meant to enter a poisoned submarine to pull strangers into daylight. The submarine herself had one final duty. After the forensic analysis was complete, the hull was patched and used for hull stress testing. She was subjected to explosive trials to understand how modern submarines withstand shock. Finally, on June 14, 1957, 2 years minus 2 days after the accident, she was towed out for the last time. She was used as a sonar target. The Sidon was sunk deliberately, this time under controlled conditions. She returned to the bottom of the ocean not as a victim of her own weaponry, but as a silent servant of the submarine service. The water closed over her for the last time, leaving no trace of the chemical fire or the 7-day battle to bring her home. The salvage was a success because it brought the truth to the surface even if the ship itself had to return to the deep.